listener production.
Hey guys, Katrina Blowers here with you for The Briefing. Now, do you remember in 2022 when cases of the Monkeypox or Mpox virus sprang up around the world? Well, believe it or not, 2024 has seen a spike in the number of cases, both overseas and here in Australia. So far this year, we've seen 40 cases. That is up from 26 cases across the whole of 2023.
You've got a situation where people kind of forget about it, the virus is still there, and everyone just goes back to normal. And so the virus goes back to normal, which is happily spreading at whatever opportunity you give it.
That is in this morning's Deep Dive with Simon Beaton. But first, he's going to join us for today's headlines. It is Friday, June 14.
Hey there. So the Ukraine has just signed an historic 10-year security deal with the US that will involve American troops, funding for weapons and ammunition, and expanded intelligence sharing. It includes Patriot missile systems and squadrons of fighter jets, including F-16s. Joe Biden and Volodymyr Zelensky shook on the deal at the G7 summit, with Biden declaring any chance for peace must be underwritten by Ukraine's ability to defend itself.
President Zelensky and I have just now signed that agreement between the United States and Ukraine. Our goal is to strengthen Ukraine's credible defense and deterrence capabilities for the long term. A lasting peace for Ukraine must be underwritten by Ukraine's own ability to defend itself now and to deter future aggression anytime in the future.
The security deal with the US is the strongest agreement since Ukraine's independence and includes a $50 billion cash loan and a commitment to support Ukraine's troops and bases in Europe.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about that $50 billion cash loan that's being offered up to Ukraine is the money for that actually comes from frozen Russian assets. A bit of a 1-2 sucker punch there from the G7 to Russia. We have already heard back from a Russian foreign ministry spokesperson on what they think of all of this. They've said that taking frozen assets is criminal and would lead to a response from Russia that would be, quote, very painful for the European Union. So we'll have to see what they mean about that. Former rugby league star Chris Dawson has lost his appeal to overturn his conviction of murdering his wife, Lynette Dawson. The 75-year-old was convicted in August of 2022, 40 years after the disappearance of his wife. Now, you might remember Chris Dawson was a teacher at the time. It was part of a very popular podcast called The Teacher's Pet, and it was supposed that his motive for the murder was so that he could pursue a relationship with one of his students. In the latest appeal, though, a panel of 3 judges in New South Wales highest court unanimously dismissed his attempt to quash his guilty verdict. One of those judges, Justice Anthony Payne, said, "I am satisfied on all evidence Dawson is guilty beyond reasonable doubt." Dawson is on a full 24-year sentence until 2046.
Yeah, that's right. And it's been a busy time in the courts. So other news to make sure that you're in the loop. The manslaughter charge has been thrown out of Greg Lynn's trial. And so this is the trial over the deaths of the campers Russell Hill and Carol Clay that occurred in Victoria's Alpine region over 4 years ago. The judge telling the jury that they can now only find Lynn guilty of murder or not guilty. And something a bit lighter to wrap up this week's headlines. So you know how Disney are recreating many of their classics as live-action movies? Well, the latest one, Moana, is about to begin filming in just a few months, and one of Australia's own has been cast in the lead role. 17-year-old Catherine Legaya from Sydney will star alongside Dwayne Johnson and Lin-Manuel Miranda. And if you're thinking that her surname sounds a bit familiar, well, her dad, Jay Legaya, is also pretty well known. He's been in Star Wars as Captain Typho and Water Rats, among many, many others.
Yeah, including Play School. He was one of my favourite Play School presenters, Jay Legaya.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it's pretty epic. Like, a side note,
Yes.
Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, never, ever ages, that man. I don't know, is he an alien? Look, I'm just putting that out there as a question. But it's so cool that his daughter, Jayla Guy's daughter, is going to be in a movie alongside him, and no doubt it'll do super well. Moana is such a beautiful story.
Yeah, definitely can't wait to see that one when it finally comes out.
That is it for the headlines today. Simon, you're sticking around for our briefing topic to tell us everything we need to know about monkeypox.
Monkeypox, or Mpox, is a pretty horrendous virus. It's from the same family as smallpox, and most of the time, if you get it, you break out in a painful fever and a rash of lesions across the hands, feet, the face, even your genitals. It's actually been known to infect humans since the 1970s, but till recently has been pretty much contained to countries in Africa. Now, monkeypox might be familiar to you from when it made international headlines during the 2022 epidemic, when it spread around the world to Europe, the Americas, and here in Australia. But why the influx in cases this year? And how worried should we be? Professor David Tscharke is from the John Curtin School of Medical Research at the Australian National University. David, what exactly is monkeypox, and how can I catch it?
Let's start with the name. So actually the infection these days, we prefer to call it Mpox. And the reason for that is that what people were finding was with a name like monkeypox, there were some people who didn't want to engage with it. They were not wanting to come forward for treatment. They were not wanting to comply with their treatment because they just didn't like the name. It's actually a little bit of a misnomer as well. So what happens sometimes when viruses are found is that they get a name according to where they were found. So it was first found in monkeys, but probably it's a virus that infects a whole lot of different animals, probably mostly rodents and stuff in Africa, but it can then be passed to whoever happens to come in contact with that animal, right? So the infection used to be called human monkeypox virus infection, which was a mouthful. So everyone just called it monkeypox virus. And then we decided to call it Mpox just to get the monkey out of it, because then people have felt a little bit more comfortable with coming forward. So if you happen to be living in the Democratic Republic of Congo or DRC, you're most likely to get it by eating bushmeat or, interacting with animals that are coming out of the forest. And that's where that virus has been circulating and essentially coming out of animals into humans for several decades now. So that's how we thought of that disease really until 2022, when we started seeing a whole lot of cases popping up in Europe, in the US, and then there were some cases in Australia. So that is essentially the same virus, and it's really spread by very close contact.
And how dangerous is it?
For the vast majority of people who get this infection, and particularly in the settings in places like Australia, it's very unpleasant. It'll cause these lesions that will hurt a lot, but by and large, they will resolve. So at the peak of when we saw a lot of infections in 2022, I think there was over 150 in Australia in total, and there was no deaths. To answer that question with a little bit more depth, right, there's a couple of different flavours of this virus, and using boring sort of science words, they're called clade 1 and clade 2. So it's kind of like red cars and blue cars, if you like.
All right.
With the exception that clade 1 tends to be associated with worse disease and a higher rate of people dying from infection. Clade 2 is considered to be more benign historically. And the virus that has been circulating in the US, in Europe and in Australia, that's from clade 2. So it's associated with less severe disease. That doesn't mean you're not going to have horrible lesions that are going to hurt a lot and are going to take, several weeks to resolve. So it's an infection you don't want to have, but for most people who have got an intact immune system, they'll resolve the infection fine. It gets dangerous for people who are immunocompromised.
So tell me a little bit more about the transmission. How do you actually get it?
Close contact. Someone has a lesion and you're basically rubbing yourself up against someone who's got a lesion with your bare skin, right? And so if you think about the population where this virus is spreading, and it's being spread largely through sexual activity, so it's that prolonged rubbing of skin against skin where you've got a lesion. That's the main way that it's being transmitted.
So given that we've got the clade 2, which is the less dangerous of the two versions, Is there a need to panic? Is this a big danger for Australians?
I would say with something like this, you never really want to panic. You want to be aware but not alarmed. I guess that's the aphorism. We don't want this virus to spread. So any virus that's come out of an animal reservoir, anytime that's moving into a new animal, and that new animal is humans, you create possibilities for that virus to change and that virus to change its characteristics. Now, the more infections that are occurring and the more intense those infections are, and the better that virus can spread, well, you're creating opportunities for it to change and to adapt to that host and to go better and to spread better, right? So what we really don't want is for that to happen.
Let's talk about the cases globally. There's been a spike which has been described as unusual. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, it's a little hard to call it a spike. There was an increase. If you look at the numbers in the States, there was an increase from around the end of last year into the start of this year, and it's now started. Cases are now starting to decline again. It's really hard to know why that's happening. I suspect that it happens in part because of complacency. When cases were rising really fast in 2022, there was a huge amount of concern. There was quite literally a run on vaccines. There was not enough vaccine around. But in the States particularly, vaccine uptake in the relevant population was only about a quarter, they found in surveys. And I suspect that that's not gotten any better. So you've got a situation where people kind of forget about it, the virus is still there, and everyone just goes back to normal. And so the virus goes back to normal, which is happily spreading at whatever opportunity you give it. And you're giving it opportunity by not being vaccinated and by not thinking about, frankly, who you're having sex with.
Do you think that in part is because we're not getting the public health messaging and the strategy to target it right?
Yeah, I think so. Public health is a really difficult thing. I mean, as we even saw through the COVID pandemic, people kind of get sick of public health messaging, right? And if you don't get it right, people just turn off and they don't listen at all. The quote's like this, and that is, if public health is doing its job, nothing happens.
Right.
and so it's a miserable job, right? Because getting that messaging just right, it's tough. And for the numbers of infections in Australia are really genuinely, they're not super high. And in the current year, we do have more cases across Australia than we had last year. But if you actually drill down into the data, that's happening in some places and not others. And we're talking about 27 cases in Victoria.
Do you think that there is some things that we should be doing differently?
We need to make sure that we maintain awareness of these viruses. Absolutely. And that's number one. To that extent, having this conversation today is really great, that we can reach people and just say, look, the virus is still out there. It hasn't gone away. And really the conditions that led to the spread in 2022, they're kind of still there if we're going to let it. I guess the good news in Australia is that when they've done surveys here, vaccination is closer to half of the population than it is in the States, where it's down to a quarter, but it's still only a half, right? There's a whole lot of people out there who could be protecting themselves. So
how bad do the infectious rates have to get before, say, someone like you would begin to be worried?
I'm always worried about this virus, right? I think anytime you allow a virus to move in a new population, it's a stepping stone to move from another population. So at the moment, this virus is mostly in men who are having sex with men. And, it's kind of easy for a lot of people to write that off and say, that's not me. But viruses don't stay in a single population if they're given an opportunity to move, and we just don't really know. We weren't expecting this virus to be circulating in that population. We expected it to stay largely in Africa. So where there is a real spike now is actually in Africa.
Okay.
And that appears to be a virus that has come out of nature relatively recently. That is a clade 1 virus. And now that we're starting to look, what we're finding is that there are incidences now that are well traced of sexual transmission of that virus. And again, because it's in Africa and it's not in Australia, we're not thinking about it. But if you ask me as a pox virologist, I'm kind of more worried about what's going on there than what's going on here.
Yeah, well, on a similar note, would more infections also potentially lead to more mutations that could be more dangerous to humans?
I mean, the answer to that question is always yes. It's not a virus that changes very quickly. It's not entirely clear the extent to which we understand that, the mutations that are in the current strain that has been circulating. But, what we do know is that the greater the intensity of spread, the more people who get it, the more infections there are, the greater the chances are that the virus will have an opportunity. It's like playing a gambling game, right? The more times you play, the more chances there are of the number coming up, right?
So finally then, David, what can someone who is listening do to keep themselves safe from Mpox?
I would say 100% that if you're in the at-risk group, so that's men who have sex with men, make sure you're vaccinated, have conversations with your partner, and they're the number one things. So be wise, know what's around, and one of the great things about this particular infection, if there's a good thing about infection, is there is a vaccine. So go to your sexual health clinic and find out how you get vaccinated.
Some great advice. Thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing, David Tscharke.
Good to be with you.
That was Professor David Tscharke from the Australian National University, and that is all that we have on this episode. Before you go though, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. And did you know we're also on YouTube? You can watch every weekend episode of The Briefing and some of our weekday deep dives. Just search Listener Newsroom on YouTube and hit subscribe. I'm Simon Beaton. See you soon.
Listener.